Hi everyone, today I'm going to show you how to use ChatGPT, which is a new chatbot by OpenAI that can really help you improve your code and learn how to write code and understand your code or other pieces of code better, get any examples of sort of code that you need to write, and even generate different applications. It's pretty cool, and it is actually the only chatbot that I've ever enjoyed, so I'm going to get into a few examples and explore the power of it, and hopefully this will convince you that it's going to be a useful tool in the future for developers. I'll link the examples in the description below so you can just click through to ones that you're interested in. So ChatGPT has a very simple interface. It's just a chatbot, so you just type in your request. I'm going to ask it to create a method in a class called calculator that sums the numbers in an array. I send that request through. I also specified the language. You can specify many different languages. It knows quite a lot. So here I am specifying that I want C#, and it's giving me the code back that will sum the numbers in an array. It's going to also give an example of how you could use it. It often will explain little different pieces of the code if it's doing something that it thinks is a clever way to do it, and it will explain sort of why it's doing that, so it's quite good to sort of understand how to improve your code as well. I'm going to ask it to add some XUnit tests for the code. Most developers like tests. They help them make sure their code isn't going to break as easily, but often it can be a bit tedious to add tests. So here I am generating some tests using the ChatGPT chatbot. I'm using the XUnit framework, which is quite a popular framework in C#. Goes ahead and generates an example test for me and asserts that it's actually correct, that the value is correct from the code. It also explains that what the test does. If you had any further questions about that code, you could actually ask the chatbot. Maybe you don't really know much about what that fact attribute does or what the square brackets are. You could ask about that. But I'm just going to ask it if it thinks there are any additional tests that would be useful, and it's going to come back to me and give me some suggestions on tests that it would recommend adding. So it's basically going to suggest a few different edge cases, like an empty array, an array with a single element, array with negative numbers, a large array, and then also just checking what would happen if there's a null array. If you want a different thing to happen, then you might want to tell the ChatGPT bot that you actually want that change made, and it would make that change for you. I'm just going to get it to add the test as I'm happy with the tests it's suggested. You could even tell it to add additional tests if you think it's missed something. So it will go ahead and write all that code. I think it'll be really useful in the future when it's integrated into your IDEs, because you're going to not have to copy and paste all the code across. And it's actually really quite smart and does do a lot of things correctly. I didn't encounter too many issues when going through my examples, and you're going to see a few, but they're all pretty minor, and in general it does help you. There are times when it gets stuck, and I think that's probably as it's just a free research preview. It might get more server power when it's when you access paid versions, and I'm really interested to see what their pricing model's like, because I'll be interested in using it. It makes things quite easy. It actually does have some smart suggestions with quite good insights that I thought it wouldn't really have as a chatbot. I'm also going to just ask it to generate me some SQL. I want it to define a many-to-many relationship for me between students and courses, and I'm going to specify what columns I want in the table, but I'm not going to tell it a data type. I'm going to sort of let it infer what it wants to from my request, and hopefully it will give me data types that I was interested in. If it didn't, then I could go ahead and say, for this column, could you please change that to be a decimal or something like that. So it goes ahead and creates my SQL. It's just going to specify what you're going to need to have a many-to-many relationship and give you the actual SQL for that. So it's saying you need the two tables that are the students and the courses table, and then it's going to give you the SQL for that, including all the data types. I'm happy with those data types that it's provided me. It's also giving you that third table. So that third table is the way that you're creating the many-to-many relationship. You need basically the foreign key to student and courses. It explains why you need that. It'll also give you a bit of an example of how to insert data. And if you needed an example of how to insert data into the student or courses table, you could also ask it to do that, and it will give you some examples. It does tend to say that, of course, there's multiple ways you can do things. I mean, there's development, and there are always many different ways you can sort of approach a problem. So it is quite good, I think, in that sense, that it's saying this isn't the only way to do things, but this is how I'm going to do it. And a lot of the time it does seem to get things quite right. Next up, I'm going to ask it to write me a method in C# that reverses an array. So just going to go and create a new array and copy the values from the first array into that reversed array. That's actually not the most efficient method, and I am aware of that. So I might go ahead and ask it to create me a more efficient implementation. It does say that this is only an example and that there are other ways to do it. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask it to make this more efficient. It's going to explain a few different ways that it could make it more efficient. So there are 3 different implementations it's suggested, including parallelizing the array reversal. It's showing me how to use that library function there. I'm going to ask it how to show me how to do it in place, which is using the same array basically, which would be swapping the elements. Sometimes you do need to be quite specific, so you can see that it's actually going to show me how to use that array.reverse method that it had previously shown me. I actually wanted to see how I might code up the in-place implementation myself. This sort of thing could actually be quite useful for when you're studying for interviews, because you can sort of see different ways of doing things and be able to learn from how it's suggesting it and what improvements could be made. So it could help you do better in interviews if you use this as a sort of study tool. So I'm asking it to do it without using the array.reverse method, as I found that I wasn't specific enough with my last question. So here it's going to give me the example how to do it in place but without the array.reverse method. So you can see that's going through half the elements, and I could ask it why it's going through half if I wasn't sure. I can ask it any sort of questions and it'll sort of explain that logic there. I may also want to make this generic because I might not have a list of numbers. I may have a list of strings, for example, so I can ask it to make it generic and it'll do that conversion for me. So you can see it's using that T to indicate that it's generic, and it's got those little triangle braces. And here it is giving an example of me reversing the array using strings. You can see the above example actually had in the method the array was still called numbers, and I wanted it to be more generic. So I may actually want to choose to rename that array, and I can actually ask the OpenAI chatbot to do that for me. So I'm going to ask it to rename the numbers parameter to elements. They'll give me the example code with everything fixed up and renamed. I think this will be really useful in the future for tidying up code once it's integrated in IDEs. And once it's a little bit faster, I found that sometimes this sort of lagged a bit and stopped. On bigger code, I imagine it would be even more problematic. So now I'm going to provide a piece of code that I want it to refactor, and I'm going to get them to refactor the properties in the code to be Pascal case. I'm just going to give it some random casing and see how it goes with that. So I'm going to add some properties. I'm going to add a first name and last name for person, so first underscore name, and I'm going to want that to be refactored to Pascal case. I'm also going to provide a last name property. I'm going to make that all lowercase and see if it picks up that name should be uppercase as well. And then I'm also going to create a method for it. I'm going to make this method lowercase just to see how it handles that, because that's not the typical convention for C#. Typically, methods in C# would also be Pascal case. I'm just going to do a console write line in here for the first and last name to make sure that it's picking up that it should be changing the first and last name inside that getInfo method. So now I've got my code, I've provided it to it, and it's going to go ahead and provide the refactored version for me. So you can see it's converted first name and last name to the correct Pascal casing, and it's also converted getInfo. So it's saying that the properties have been updated based on my request, and it's also saying that getInfo has been updated to follow the convention. So it knows that this is a convention that is common in C# and applies that convention even though I didn't ask it to. I might want to add a backing field for a property, so I'm going to ask it to do that for me now. And I may want to make the setter private, so I could also request that. The OpenAI chatbot is going to go ahead and make those changes for me. So you can see it's added that backing field that's a private string underscore last name, as is the C# conventions, and it's made that setter private. It explains a little bit of what the code is doing here. Once again, if you don't really understand any of the code, it will go ahead and explain it. You can actually copy in code and it'll explain that for you. I want to test that it sort of knows design patterns a little bit, so I'm going to ask it to make the following class a singleton. So I'm just creating a class called mySingleton. What I'm going to add to this is just a simple method, and also I'm going to add a public constructor, which you wouldn't get in a singleton. So first off, I'm just going to add my method, which is just going to console write line doing something. I'm just adding that because that's what I'm going to need to call on my instance. A singleton, if you don't know what a singleton is, basically is where you can only create one instance of the class. So it's a class that you can only create one object of. So you wouldn't have a public constructor for a singleton because you want to be able to restrict people from creating them. So I'm going to get the OpenAI chatbot to go ahead and fix that up and convert it to a singleton. Inside my constructor, I'm just going to console write line that I'm creating the singleton instance. It's going to go ahead and modify my code to make it a singleton. You can see that it creates a private static field for instance, which is basically my instance, and it'll only instantiate that if it's null, otherwise it'll just return the instance. And also it's made my constructor private. It explains why it's done these changes. So that if you weren't sure of what was required to make something a singleton in the future, you'd be able to do it, or you'd be able to understand the code that they have created. Now this isn't actually thread safe. If two threads tried to access that singleton instance at the same time, there would be some issues. They could both create the new instance. I'm going to ask it to convert the getInstance method to a property. That's quite a common way of implementing a singleton in C#, is that you'd use a property instead of a get method. That's just because it's a bit more standard there. In other languages you can do things differently, but this is just more common in C#. So you can see inside that get for the property, it's added that code from the get instance method that it had previously. It explains what it's done to make the changes. And it also gives you an example of how to use it and access that singleton instance. Now, as I mentioned, this isn't actually thread safe, so I'm going to ask it to make this thread safe. Saying please, because it's kind to be kind to your chatbot AI. So it's going to show me how to add a lock, and that lock is basically going to stop different threads from accessing my single instance if another thread has it currently. But you can see that lock is around my entire get, and that actually can mean that only one thread can access the instance field at a time. I might just want to prevent threads from creating the instance multiple times, so I can ask it to make those changes, and I'm going to do that in a moment. So I'm asking it to only lock on creating my Singleton instance. So it's going to go ahead and make those changes for me. And these are changes that I'm happy with. Pretty impressed with how the OpenAI ChatGPT handles things and understands code quite well. I really didn't think it'd be at this level. I thought there'd be quite a lot of flaws. You can see there that sort of cut out partway through outputting my code of how to access the Singleton instance, but that's all right. Sometimes you don't need that final part, and you can actually ask it to continue or try again if you did need that. I'm going to ask it a question about if it can find me an API to get the current weather, and that would be useful if you're just looking for ways to get certain things. It knows a lot about what other code has done, and it can find you examples of how to do certain things in different languages and just make your life quite easy. It's going to be really useful, I think, in the future to help reduce the need for documentation of code, because it's going to be able to help you sort of generate examples that are relevant to your context without having to read so much code on like different documentation websites and adjust it to your situation. It'll adjust it for you to your situation. So basically what it's done is it's found an API endpoint that I requested, and it's given me an example of how I'd go about calling that API endpoint and what I would do with the response. Tells me a bit about the different packages that it could be using. So if I wanted to change anything there, I could, and I'm just going to accept that that's quite good. And yeah, it does say that there are other ways to write this code, but I've found that it's generally gives quite reasonable code, and that's a good starting point. I'm going to ask if I could get that example in a different language, and it's going to go ahead and give me that example in that other language. So it could be quite good if you find something that does what you want in one language and you want to convert it into another language in the future so that you can do that. So maybe you're switching your code system from one language to another just because maybe you started in Node.js and you are finding that you would rather have some of the a more like object-oriented language, like maybe you want to use C# and just have a bit more structure. So yeah, you can go find code examples in another language and you can get them to get it converted into your language, and it'll just speed up your development process because you're not going to need to do that conversion yourself. it's probably a bit safer, as people are quite prone to making mistakes and missing things. I'm not saying it's going to be perfect all of the time. It does warn you that it doesn't necessarily have accuracy, so it is important that you've got tests in place to make sure that things are as you would expect. I'm going to ask if I need to install the request module, because it said that I'm going to need to use the request module to make those HTTP requests in Python, and it's going to give me a bit of an explanation about how I will need to install the request module and some examples of how I could go about installing those, and some managers that I could use to, package managers that I could use to do those installs. You can also ask it to give you regex expressions for specific things. So I'm going to ask it to give me the regex to validate an email address. So I find that I'm often not the best with regex, and so I'll go to one of those regex pattern matching sites and just sort of fiddle around with my regex until I get it correct. But this is going to give you what you need, and you could probably ask it to make some modifications if you wanted to, and it will give you what limitations the regex has and a little bit of reason why it's given you that specific regex. If you wanted to, you could copy and paste this into one of those regex sites and just test it meets your needs. So I'm going to ask it a more general question that's sort of more opinion-based. I've asked it whether I should use Flutter or React Native. It does say that it depends on your specific requirements and preferences. It'll explain a bit about each platform and give some benefits of each platform. I think this is pretty valid. It's basically saying that it depends a bit on what your requirements are and your language preferences, because Flutter uses Dart, which is not that common for developers to know, but React Native uses JavaScript, which a lot of developers know. Talks about the performance, the communities, and the different features available for both, and basically says they're both good platforms. It just depends on which one you would suit your needs better, so it's best to try both and evaluate what would be better for you. I'd say that's pretty balanced advice and generally stands true. There's a reason why both communities are large. Now I'm going to provide a piece of code that won't compile and ask it to fix it. I'm going to put quite a lot of mistakes in here, so I'm actually testing that it does quite well with finding issues. It's not just one issue, there's quite a few different issues in this code. So basically I've missed my class modifier when defining my class. I'm going to miss the return type when defining my method. I'm going to call my method write to console. I'm going to pass a parameter in, but I'm not going to specify the type of the parameter. That parameter is going to be a string, but I'm not going to tell the OpenAI bot what that parameter type is. I'm then going to console.writeLine that parameter. And I'm going to miss off my semicolon, and then I'm going to add an extra curly brace. So yes, it says the C# code you provided won't compile because it contains several syntax errors, and then it goes ahead and fixes my code. It also tells me what changes it's made and explains the changes, so basically you can learn from your mistakes a bit more easily, as you don't need to figure out what's going wrong as much on your own. So I feel like this is a really useful tool to help you learn different languages, as if you've got some mistakes, it's going to help you identify them. So now I'm going to show you how to get it to convert one piece of code to another. So I'm just copying a very simple piece of code here, which is that write to console method. And I'm going to ask it to convert the code to JavaScript, which is a common programming language. So it's going to show me how to do that. So it's going to give me a function that console logs the parameter, and that's basically doing the same thing as console.writeLine. I don't need to define the type, as this is JavaScript. I'm also going to ask it to give me the Google oAuth endpoints. This is quite useful because you don't need to go off and search for them. When you Google them, you can find them, but it's not necessarily the first thing that pops up. So it's going to give you the different endpoints, and you can actually ask if they can give you an example of how you'd go about using these, and I'm going to do that in a moment. It also talks a bit about how you would go about using those endpoints. So it says you need to obtain a client ID and secret and then use these credentials to send requests to endpoints, which you can then use to authenticate and authorize users with their Google account. It does add the disclaimer that this is just the main endpoint. So if you want further ones, you can actually request them. Like if you want the one to revoke a token, which is what you'd do if the user were to log out. So now I'm going to give an example implementation of the PKCE flow using the above endpoints. So it's going to tell me a bit about what request you're going to need to make and what the parameters are going to be. It's going to give me the API endpoint addresses and what sort of parameters I need to pass to it. It'll also describe each of these parameters so it's quite clear to you what they mean and which ones you're going to need to change. So I've asked for a very specific flow, the PKCE oAuth flow. If you're interested in knowing a bit more about oAuth, you can look into that. But basically this will allow you to do things very quickly, without having to know a whole heap of stuff. It's going to give you some good guidance and some good, easy to follow explanations of what different things are, without having to have a whole heap of background knowledge, and you're going to be able to implement things a lot faster that way. Once again, I think it's a really good learning tool because if you have any questions and anything you're unsure about, you can follow that up with the OpenAI chatbot. My husband's actually recently started developing and he's really excited about this because he doesn't have like a large technical background. He only started a few months ago and he's already in his first job. He did think that initially the chatbot didn't have enough information on the framework he's using, but you actually just have to sometimes give it more targeted questions and then it will be able to answer your questions. So I'm going to ask it to tidy up the following code for me and remove the duplicate code. I'm just going to create a very simple method that's just going to be a C# method here. I don't need to specify that it's C#. It's actually going to pick up that C# based on that I'm using console.writeLine, which is a C# way of outputting to the console. I'm also asking it to put it inside a class because currently it's just a method outside of a class. My method's basically going to sum numbers and then console writeLine them. And I've asked it to remove the duplicate code. I'm going to do this twice so that it can find the duplicate code to remove. This is actually quite a simple example, but it's going to be quite good because it's going to actually explain to you why it doesn't refactor things in a certain way. So it goes ahead and rewrites my code, and you can see it's created a method called add numbers. And then it's just still got the duplicate console write lines. So you may wonder why it doesn't actually add the console.write line to the add numbers, and I'm going to get it to explain that in a second, and I actually completely agree with why it does that. But yeah, it's extracted that addition logic into the add numbers method. You can see it's given it a reasonable name for what it actually is doing too, so it's actually quite smart in that aspect. I didn't tell it what to name that method. It looked at what the code was doing and gave it a name. So now I'm going to ask it to refactor the console.write lines too. And so it's going to go ahead and do that. It's actually creating a separate method there to put the console write line code in. And you may wonder why it doesn't just put it inside the add numbers. It also tells you why it's using the private access modifier. And that's just because it's used internally within my class. It tells you why you might put it into its own method. And it's basically saying that so that you can do it separately without modifying the initial method. It makes things a bit more like testable. So now I'm asking why it didn't put the console write line and addition in the same method. And it's going to interpret my question as I intended and tell me why it didn't do that. So it's saying that it wants to separate the two concerns because they're not related. Adding and console write lines are not sort of related, and it's kind of following the solid principles that you want sort of a single responsibility. You don't want to be modifying. You don't want too much going on in one place that's not related. You sort of want to keep those separate so that you can test the code separately and more easily. So you may have noticed that the add numbers method was private, so I want to ask it now how I go about testing the private method. That's kind of like a common thing that is kind of an issue when you're wanting to write unit tests. You've got this small modular thing that's really easy to unit test, but it's actually private because it's only used within that class. So I'm going to go ahead and ask that. It's saying that you can use this internals visible attribute to make the method accessible to your test assembly. I'm not 100% sure this is correct. I'm pretty sure that it's only private protected ones or internal methods that would be accessible if you use that internals visible to attribute. So I'm not 100% sure this is actually correct, but that's what it is saying. So you'd want to be actually testing this. You might find that this is not actually correct. It does have a disclaimer that not everything is correct. It would be pretty hard for it to get everything right. So you do have to be aware that sometimes it's going to get things wrong, but it really does guide you in a good direction a lot of the time. So yeah, I checked whether it's sure that internal visible to allows access to private methods. It does say that, but then it also talks about the internal access modifier. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure. That is not a little bit confused there. But yeah, test it if you want to. This may have changed since I last wrote a unit test for a private method. I'm pretty sure that private protected is the better approach there, but yeah. You can ask it a bit about more general topics like what sort of architecture templates might be good for C#, and it'll come back to you with some common ones that are used and a bit of description about them. So it's going to give me that model view controller as a design pattern that would be quite commonly used. It will give me about model view model, and it'll explain a bit about the benefits of these different architectures and why you might use them. It's also going to talk about microservices, which is a pretty popular architecture. It does say you should use the one that's best fit for your project, and obviously that's going to depend a lot. So there's still room for personal input, and I think that's where that gap is at the moment for AI. It's not at that stage where it's going to take over our jobs. There's still quite a gap, but it is a gap that is narrowing, and it's best to work with it for now because it can really improve your efficiency. You could see it kind of cut out a bit partway through that question, so I asked it to try again. I'm going to skip over a bit of this trying again because it's a bit repetitive and can take a little while. So I've found, like I said, that because it's a free preview, sometimes it does cut out. I'm sure that would be fixed in a paid version with more dedicated server resources. I think there are a lot of people trying it out at the moment because it is quite new and exciting. But yeah, sometimes we'll give you a different response the next time. So you can actually ask questions multiple times if you aren't sure that the answer fits exactly what you want, but you feel like you're asking the right question. So I might be someone who learns better from actual examples of code. So I might ask it to provide me an example of what the microservices code might look like. I can ask it for different templates. If I wanted a specific template, I've asked it for the clean code architecture, for example, before. So it's going to go ahead and provide me a bit of an example here. It usually provides you a pretty simple example, and then you can go ahead and you can go ahead and request changes, and it'll go make those changes for you. And from there, you can sort of adapt things to a bit more catered to your personal situation if you aren't the best at writing code. And you can sort of see how it would go about doing things. So you can see it's calling lots of different endpoints basically that are going to get the data, and that's because different microservices have very granular responsibilities. I think these are probably even more granular than you would typically have. You've just got a very granular one that's responsible for user ID, one that's responsible for user info, one that's responsible for name, and one that's responsible for address. You can see that it cut out there, but I'm not too worried about that because I am not actually going to use that code. I'm just showing you guys as an example. If I were really desperate to use that code, I could click try again, so it would regenerate me that code. But I know that sometimes you can risk microservices architecture getting into bad states because maybe part of the system's down and you haven't handled that sort of situation appropriately. It's kind of really important to think about and design and advance resiliency into your microservice architecture. So I'm asking OpenAI chatbot a bit about how I can handle that. So you can see sometimes it does encounter an error, and if that's the case, it's okay. You just click try again. So I'll tell you a few ways that you can reduce the risk that your microservice architecture is going to end up in a bad state. It talks about how you can use an API gateway to improve the security and reduce the risk that you're going to run out of resources. It talks about monitoring and logging your microservices so that you can shut things down before they hit a bad state. And it also talks a bit about how you can use circuit breakers and retries, and also how to use rolling deployments and blue-green deployments so that you can easily roll back to your previous state if something does go wrong. So I'm a bit interested in circuit breakers and retries, so I'm going to ask it to give me an example of how I would implement that. It knows the context of what your conversation has been, so it's actually going to, it would, even if I didn't specify that it was in C#, it would provide that previous example and add the circuit breaking and retries for that. So yeah, it's going to go ahead and pick up a common C# NuGet package for that sort of thing and use that. So that common NuGet package I mentioned is Poly. Basically, it allows you to easily retry and specify when you want to stop retrying, when there's an issue with your requests or microservices. It's quite powerful, and there are lots of different ways you can configure it. Just if you were interested, you could just check the documentation. You could try and specify using OpenAI different different times you want to retry and different times you want to break out of trying. But yeah, it's added it in here and shown how you would use that with actually calling the different microservices that you have. You can see that they are microservices. They're all running on different endpoints. So they've all got different servers. So they've got different ports that you can access them on. So showing that they're basically different applications. You can see it cut out there once again. So it is quite common that it cuts out. And yeah, sometimes you're just going to need to tell it to retry so that you can get past that. I'm going to get it to create me a C# API now that allows me to download a PDF with Hello World text in it. So that's not a specific, not a super complex task, but it's going to require it to sort of know about different libraries that would help with creating a PDF, and it's going to need to know a bit about how C# APIs work. So it's going to give me an example. I'm actually going to show you this actually running because it's a little bit more complex. So yeah, it gives me the namespace of my app. If I wanted to change that to match whatever my actual namespace was, I could do that, and it gives me a class. I could change that, ask it to change that if I wanted to as well. And it writes me the code that will generate a PDF that I can then go ahead and download. Tells you a bit about how the code works and what's happening in the code so that you can understand it and make any changes if you felt like OpenAI ChatGPT wasn't up to what you needed. But yeah, I'm quite happy with that. I might want to ask it how to send a GET request to that endpoint. Maybe I have someone who wants to make a call to that endpoint to actually get the data. And I want to be able to just generate maybe some documentation on how to do it. So yeah, this could also be useful for generating documentation in the future, although I think that would be less necessary as this gains more and more knowledge and power of how to do development. So you can see it makes that request and then writes that file to your local system. It also tells you how you can run it using the .NET CLI. If you're planning on using that, I'm just using Visual Studio, and I'm going to actually go ahead and show you this in Visual Studio now. So I've got Visual Studio and I'm going to create a new app. I'm going to choose API as I'm going to create a new API, and I'm going to use controllers. I'm not going to uncheck to use minimal APIs. I just want to keep with the normal controllers that I'm reasonably used to. You can use minimal APIs if you want. So if I go ahead and open my app, which I've given that name just so that my namespace would match up and I wouldn't need to change it, I could just copy and paste my controller directly in. You can see if I go look at my weather forecast controller, it actually extends controller base, and it has a few different attributes against it, which our current API that we've generated with OpenAI Chat GPT hasn't got. So if I go back to my chatbot, then I can go and ask it to make these changes. So I'm asking it to convert my PDF controller into a web API controller, which is basically what those that other controller, the weather forecast controller, is. And so OpenAI chatbot's going to think about that for a moment and then go make my changes for me. So you can see that it's added those different attributes, and it's also extending controller base now. The code largely remains the same. It also explains a little bit about what the changes are. You can see it cut out there, but I'm not too interested in the explanation. I'm just wanting the code. I can understand C# code reasonably well as I work with it day to day. Sorry if you can hear the rain in the background, it's just raining here. So I'm going to add a new class. And I'm going to name that PDF controller. And I'm just going to copy and paste my code from the OpenAI GPT chatbot. You can see they've got a few errors, and it's just this NuGet package has not been imported. I'm going to go ahead and add that. So I go to my dependencies, and I'm going to go to NuGet and manage NuGet packages. I'm sure once OpenAI chatbot is integrated within our IDEs at some point, which I'm sure would be a step that would be important for it to be really useful. This would be possible from within it, but for now you're going to have to go and resolve those sorts of inputs yourself. So you do sort of need to understand a bit of what's going on. You can't just write code without having any understanding. I'm going to go ahead and build, and you can see there's a build error. So let's go ahead and fix that up. So you can see that it's giving me this error on this line here, and I can just use the IDE to fix that. So it's basically conflicting references. It wasn't sure what to use. So some things do need to be resolved from within. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this. And when it runs, what it's going to do is it's just going to open up the Swagger, which includes my API endpoint for downloading the PDF. If I go to that URL, which is just the same as my Swagger endpoint, but with the end of /API/PDF/hello-world. It's going to go ahead and prompt me to allow the download of the PDF, which I've accepted, and when it downloads it's going to open that PDF, and you can see that PDF displays Hello World successfully, and that is what I had requested from the ChatGPT chatbot, so I'm really impressed with that. I'm going to ask it now to help me create a tic-tac-toe game in React Native. So you're going to see that I'm going to cut out some of this part here because it actually is going to get stuck quite a few times creating this because it's a bit more complex code. It's not short code. It's reasonably short, but it's not super short. While it's starting to create, I'm going to just create my actual Expo React Native app because I actually am going to want to demo it working to you and show a few problems that came about, but they're all minor problems, and for the most part it generates most of the code for you, so it's pretty cool. So it goes ahead and it generates the code for you. If you try again, it will actually generate different code and sometimes may generate different requirements, like sometimes it might handle having a winner and sometimes it might just endlessly allow you to play without handling a winner. So in that way it sort of doesn't always give you the same response, and that's why it can be worth trying again if you don't get exactly what you want, or asking it to refine if it does give you enough stuff. I'm going to change into my tic-tac-toe directory and start up that app. Just while it goes ahead and generates that code. And I'm going to open that app on iOS, and it's going to load up. At the moment, I actually don't have any tic-tac-toe code in there, and I'm generating it at present. It gets stuck quite a few times, failing to generate because I think the servers are quite busy. So I'm going to skip to a point where I actually managed to get it to successfully generate. As you use these tools a bit more, you're actually going to gain some efficiency in how you actually learn to use them. So you're going to see that this actually cuts out once again generating my React Native application code, but I can actually just ask it to continue from the above code. So it doesn't actually need to start again, and that will stop it from failing midway through. When I ask it to try again, it has to regenerate, and it's often regenerating a completely new set of code. When I ask it to continue, it, even if it gets stuck a little bit further on, at least it's going to have most of the code already there, and I'm going to eventually get my complete piece of code, whereas before I was finding that I spent quite a while trying to generate it, but it just never was sort of coming to an end because it kept failing towards some point of the application. So it's going to basically check whether there's it's going to basically render the board and allow you to press on the board and put noughts and crosses on the board depending on who is playing currently. It's going to handle all that logic for me, so that's quite cool. I don't need to do any code, it just sort of generates this for me. But I am going to need to piece together the code in this example because I've asked it to continue on because it did fail partway through. It explains a bit about how the code works as well. So it explains a bit about the logic of the code and how it works and what functionality it provides. It often will say if it's limited in certain functionality as well. So I'm going to copy that code across into my application. And I've opened Visual Studio Code so I can copy that in, and I've got my simulator open so you can see the changes. So I'm just going to paste in that whole code, and you can see that it's not complete, so I'm going to need to go get that second part of the code from the ChatGPT chatbot. So I'm going to copy that code too. And I'm going to fix up this render board function, which was incomplete, and that's where my code had cut off. So now I'm going to save that, and it's going to show my tic-tac-toe game. But if I'm clicking on screen, I'm noticing it's not actually making those changes. I do understand the code, so I can read it a bit, and I can see there's a handle cell press on the view. That's the on press property of that view there. So it should be calling that handle cell press. You might want to add some console logging to sort of see if that's actually being called and maybe something else is going wrong. So yeah, there is some troubleshooting that you may encounter, but it's pretty cool how it generates a lot of code for you, and mostly just works. So if it's pressed, I'm just going to console log pressed. I just want something simple to tell me that's actually being pressed. So I can see that isn't actually being triggered. So I'm going to just investigate and find out why. It's clearly something that OpenAI ChatGPT isn't handling very well, and so isn't aware of an issue there. A quick Google told me that basically the view doesn't have an on-press property, and that you might want to use touchable opacity. I know there's actually a pressable component now, but I am just going to use touchable opacity for simplicity. But I'm going to see if OpenAI knows why it's not working. So I'm just going to say pressing on cell isn't working. Do you know why? So I've asked it, and it's saying that basically the view component does not have an on-press prop, and that the handle cell press function will not be called when the user taps on the game cell. It's saying that you can add that on-press prop to the view, and it will allow the handle cell press function to be called when the user taps on the game cell. But it just gives me that exact same code basically that I had previously. And so I think that it's not quite realizing that it can't actually give an on-press to the view. It's just not going to work. So we'll go ahead and fix that. So you can see that render cell does already have that handle cell press function. So I'm just going to go ahead and change that view to be a touchable opacity. To do that, I'm going to need to import touchable opacity. And if I go ahead and save those changes, it should work. So now I can click on my tic-tac-toe game. Okay, you can see it hasn't quite taken into account the fact that I actually have my font size increased for accessibility and just to show you guys the app more clearly. So I'm going to need to manually adjust that font size, and now you can see those tic-tac-toe noughts and crosses appear more clearly. If I have a success, it's not going to tell me that I'm successful, and it's going to allow me to continue playing. And you can see I can override different boxes or cells. So I'm going to ask OpenAI to make those changes for me to allow me to have a winner. So I'm going to ask it to add the ability to basically check for a winner and stop the game at that point. And it's going to go ahead and give me that code. So it explains how you can identify when the winner is found, and then it's saying how it's going to approach it and what it's going to add to your code. It's basically generating the same code, but it's going to add additional things like whether the game is over. And it's going to add those checks for whether the game is over before it handles that cell press. If the game is over, it's not going to want to do anything with the cell press. It's also going to check whether there's a win. And if there is, it's going to set that the game is over. I'm going to skip ahead because it did start to cut out again. So I'm just going to skip to when the code is actually successful from the OpenAI chatbot. It does get stuck a few times. So when it gets stuck at this point, I'm going to actually specify when I want it to continue from, because sometimes it'll continue with a bit of a gap. And I think that's just when OpenAI, ChatGPT actually is further ahead in what it is processed than what it is output to the person. So I've asked it to continue from that handle reset button press function definition so that I know exactly what code to put in and I'm not putting in incorrect code or incomplete code. So I'll continue on from that point onwards. So we're almost at the end of the code, but you can see that didn't quite complete the styles. So I'm just going to ask it to continue from the styles constant definition onwards. It's really cool how you can specify where you want it to continue onwards just to make sure that you know exactly where it is in the code and make your combining of the code easier, although obviously it would ideally just complete. It is powerful enough to sort of fix itself and resolve from sort of failures, and I'm sure it will get more stable in the future as this is just the initial release and it's still reasonably new, and I'm really impressed with the power behind it and how strong its general thoughts are on things, and even just like the design of software. It's not giving you really poorly written software. It gives you reasonable quality software, so that's not so bad. I didn't actually ask it to update that touchable opacity side of things, so I'm going to need to go ahead and update that again afterwards, as I changed that without telling it to change that. If I'd asked it to change it, then it would have included that change in future revisions and and I wouldn't have had to go back and make manual changes. So I'm just going to copy that styles, and that's going to be the end of my code, and I can go back and update that touchable opacity cell basically so that I can handle my on press. Oh yeah, and I forgot to say, I also asked it to add a reset button so that it can reset the board and I can play the game again, because you're not just going to want to play the game once and then have a useless app that you're going to have to exit out of. You're going to want to be able to get back to a state where you can enjoy it again. So after I save it, it's got this new grid. It's actually changed my UI a little bit, but that's fine, probably to handle that reset button. And if I go ahead and play my game and win, it'll tell me that I won, and it won't let me press on anything else because the game is over. So it's saying the game is complete, you cannot keep playing. Now if I go ahead and have a draw, it's going to tell me that there's a draw, and once again my reset option will be available to me. So you can see that's told me that there's a draw because no one has won, no one has 3 in a row, and that's a draw. So you can see how you can actually use it to build a reasonably, like an app with a reasonable amount of logic. I'm pretty sure that if I spent more time, I could build a more complex app, and I probably will do a demo of how to do that at some stage, as I know a lot of people are learning to code, and that's why they're finding us on YouTube to sort of learn a bit more from. So I think that this would aid those people who have some code but aren't quite sure what different parts are doing. You can copy and paste that code into the ChatGPT OpenAI chatbot and actually see why it's doing what it's doing, because it will explain it well. And if you don't understand a particular part of the explanation, you can ask more questions and it'll be able to respond to you about why something is done a certain way or what it means. So now I'm going to ask it to create me a component. So I could just get it to create me any number of components really, and it's just going to speed up my app development because I'm not going to need to do all the scaffolding. It's not going to create the most pretty components, so you're probably going to want to go ahead and style that. But you can see it's creating me a profile component here with the image, name, age, occupation and birthday, and it's going to give me some styling for those as well. I like how it's giving me different style for each sort of text that I have, even though they're mostly the same, because it means that if I did want to control that styling a bit more fine-grained, I'm not going to have to do a whole heap of refactoring to the code to change it. It's going to be mostly there, and I can just edit the ones that I want to edit. So I'm going to create a new folder for my component. I'm just going to use my tic-tac-toe game because it's already open, just for simplicity. But obviously this is not part of the tic-tac-toe game. So I'm going to create my user profile screen and copy my code in. I realized I forgot to name it as a JavaScript file, so I'm just going to rename it now. And that's basically a component that I can use and import from my app.js. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this code out and use that new component that I've created. Well, that the OpenAI ChatGPT bot has created. So I'm going to go ahead and import my user profile screen, and I'm not going to need that those imports from React Native, as I'm going to use my user profile screen, but first I'm going to just display that for you. So I'm just going to add that user profile screen and return that from the app, and you can see I've got a little image that's in a nice circle. It's got a name and it's got an age, occupation and birthday. So I can ask it to make some changes. So I might want to make the profile picture have a shadow, and I want to make the name bold. And I also might want to make it so I could do style changes. And I could also do passing the info as properties, because typically you're going to want components that are reusable, and reusable components are great. Just you can use them for with many different users. You're not going to want Jane Doe or John Doe all the time. You might want John Smith or whoever your users are. You're not going to want to hard code those values, and you want to pass them as properties. So I've asked it to make those changes, and it's going ahead and making those changes so that I can pass in the name, age, occupation, birthday, and profile pic URI. So first I'm just going to add those properties to my app.js. So like I said, you do actually need to have a bit of understanding on how things are working, because I need to sort of specify my properties. I'm just going to copy those from my my existing user profile screen, because I was quite happy with the data they provided me. But I might give, like, for example, I can't be bothered finding a profile picture image. I can pass my own age in. He looked kind of like quite young, so we'll give him age 22. We'll give him a name. It's just my name. Occupation. We'll make him an AI expert, and we can give him a birthday as well. I'm just going to say that it's today. I'm going to go ahead now and get that code that passes in the values as properties, so that I can see my new properties based on what I passed in. So he was John Doe, age 32, occupation software engineer, but now he is my name, age 22, AI expert with his birthday today. And I've passed it in from the app.js instead of having it hard-coded. So like I said, I can also ask it to make some stylistic changes. So I'm just going to ask it to add a shadow to the profile pic. Some of these things don't necessarily always work, and I'm not going to spend too much time investigating them. But I think just giving additional commands, and it'll be able to give you better outputs. I'm also going to make the name bold. It goes ahead and generates my code. I think it's a bit quicker this time because it's quite a simple request and a lot of the code has already been generated. It's just making some adjustments. It seems when it's generating code from scratch that it can be a little bit slower. But I mean, that's kind of understandable. I'd be interested in pushing these capabilities a bit further in the future with like maybe a more complex game and maybe some more packages I want it to use. And yeah, I'm really excited to explore how this can help me be a bit more efficient with my code, and maybe even generate some code that I use in tutorials. So I'm going to copy that code with that new styling. I'm going to paste it on in. I'm noticing that the name is bold, but I'm not really noticing that the shadow was as bad as bold, but that's okay. I'm wanting to test a bit further how far it can go in terms of design, so I'm going to ask it if it could convert that design into a more material design style and just sort of see what it gives me back. So it says here's an updated user profile using that material design style. I can see that's using a React Native paper package. And so that's going to obviously have some sort of material design styling. I'm interested to see what it looks like when I get into the application. So it's using some chips, it's using card, and it's using avatar. It's still keeping like the properties that I've passed in and everything else I've sort of specified, so that's quite good. And now that's complete, I'm going to copy and paste it into my application. I suspect this is going to have an issue in that I don't have that React Native paper package installed, but I'm going to copy it anyway. It hasn't told me to install it, which I think would be an improvement. If it's getting me to use a package, I would like it to tell me that it's actually needs to be imported. But I mean, for anyone that has quite a bit of experience with development, you would probably understand that quite quickly. It also recognises the error message, so it's not a big deal. So I'm just going to go ahead and add that React Native paper package. It's going to go ahead and install that. And once that's done, I can go ahead and start my application again. It's opening on iOS. And it's giving me another area that it's unable to resolve module React Native safe area context. So I'm obviously going to need to go ahead and install that as well, because that is necessary for the React Native paper package. But yeah, I didn't realize because I'm just doing an install directly from what I've sort of getting as errors here. If I copy and paste this error into the OpenAI chatbot, it would actually probably give me what to do. It's actually, I've seen it work quite well in that sort of context. So I've gone and installed that package, and now I can start my application again. And I'm interested to see what it will look like. Obviously, it's not going to be an expert at design at this stage. It's quite a human-centric thing to sort of be able to envision what's going to look good. I can see it's sort of part way off the screen, but it is a nice card and is sort of following material design. Yeah, so I've really enjoyed exploring the OpenAI ChatGPT with you today. If you've enjoyed this, please let me know and like and subscribe for more content. I will be creating some applications using this in the future. I may even go live with it so we can sort of work through something together. And just let me know in the comments what sort of things you'd be interested in creating using ChatGPT and what sort of things you think it would be useful for and what sort of gaps you think there are. I'm really interested in hearing people's thoughts on this exciting new tool for us.